Good afternoon. I'm Alex Thomson, I'm the Chief Executive of Localis. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. Thank you for coming along in the middle of what I'm sure is a busy working week for you all. I'm particularly delighted to welcome our speaker, Rory Stewart. I have written down hot foot from the bear pit of PMQs, but I understand that he didn't quite manage to squeeze into the bear pit of PMQs, it being so full of bears. A little bit of housekeeping. Rory will talk for roughly 20 minutes and then we'll open up to Q&A, but we will be finished absolutely latest 2 p.m. And indeed before that if we run out of questions, but I'm sure you look like a question-packed audience to me. I should also say we're filming today's event and the video will be on our website soon, so please do point any friends and colleagues who are unable to be here today in the direction of localis.org.uk. And if you are a member of the Twitterati, the hashtag for today's event is Localis Rory. You can see it's on the wall there, and possibly on this or on the back there somewhere. Also, there are a couple of seats at the front. Justin, if you want to come up and sit here. Don't think you have to stand. So, local democracy. If you're not familiar with Localis, we're a think tank. We've been around and pushing the cause for localism for well over a decade now. When we started, it was deeply unfashionable. Today, the profile of localism, pleasingly, is much higher. However, we were starting from the low point. The last few decades have seen sinking levels of political engagement. At the same time, there was, of course, a seemingly inexorable centralisation of power, and I can't help wondering if those two things are connected. If you don't think your voice can materially influence the things that matter to you where you live, then you may well conclude that your energies would be better directed into other activities. The coalition government has, I believe, started to reverse this malign trend. There are millions of policies I could pour on all day, but you don't want to hear me do that. I'm a big fan of neighbourhood planning, I will mention, for instance. And the idea of city deals is a good one, though I would argue should be applied to the whole country. Some proposed measures, such as the introduction of elected mayors, have failed to capture the public imagination, but the concept that decisions are best made as close as possible to those affected is one that I think has growing currency across the political spectrum. Will it be enough to reignite the guttering flame of local democratic engagement though? And with that question in mind, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Rory has a strong claim to having the most interesting CV in Parliament. In addition to being a successful author, he's been a soldier, he's been the governor of an Iraqi province, he's founded a charity and he's been a professor at Harvard, which is enough for a couple of lifetimes, I would have thought. And now he has a well-earned reputation as one of the most thoughtful and erudite people on the political scene. And I'm therefore very much looking forward to hearing his thoughts on what, for me and us here at Localis, and you, I hope, is an absolutely crucial topic, the future of local democracy. So over to you, Rory.
Well, welcome. And since the theme of my talk is very much that the genius of Britain lies in the population, I'm very much hoping that this is going to be more about you talking than me talking. But just to begin by setting out a few principles. The first thing is that as a very new Member of Parliament, and I've only been a Member of Parliament now for just under 4 years, I have been very surprised by the extraordinary talent in Britain and our extraordinary inability to use it. And what do I mean by this? I mean that when I turn up in almost any village in Cumbria, I find myself looking at a place stuffed full, often of young retired people, recently retired telecoms engineers, or people who've retired from the army, or who may be school teachers from Manchester who bought a house in the Lake District, and they're pulsing with energy and thoughts, and they're able to pin me down and question every element of what's happening in relation to broadband policy. They can challenge me about exactly how a point-to-point microwave link operates, or they want to know exactly why we haven't adopted a cellular system, or what the upload speeds may or may not be on satellite. And at the same time, these people are devoting themselves day after day to running parish councils, to saving the local medieval library, to organising a sports day, or they're investing very heavily in their work with Amnesty or Save the Children, or they're volunteering as first responders, which is to say providing emergency medical aid, or they're volunteering in the mountain rescue on the mountainside. But the one thing they are not doing is getting involved in what we used to call politics, which is to say that almost none of them are members of political parties or would ever want to be a member of a political party. And indeed, if one ever suggests in any way that they might get involved in what we used to call politics, people respond with absolute abhorrence. I'm not a politician, I don't do politics, I don't want to be political. This is manifested in more and more eccentric ways. For example, a campaign group, 38 Degrees, turned up to see me, and they sent emails to a lot of my constituents encouraging them to come and meet their MP to complain about what they call the gagging bill. So I suddenly find myself in my constituency surgery dealing with 52 people who I haven't seen before, all of whom have turned up at an instant at the same point and the same time to raise the same issues. And they are vigorously well informed, they've been reading the legislation, they have points to make about every detail of the legislation, they have constitutional theories. So when they're talking about the gagging bill, obviously they have things to say about freedom of speech, things to say about freedom of association. But the deepest single common theme is that none of them wish to be perceived as being engaged in politics. And this creates a problem. And it's a problem not just for us, but I think it's a problem going forward over the next 50, 100, 200 years. Because Britain is at the prow of history. We're at the front end of the boat of history. We were the first country to industrialize, first country to deindustrialize, and the kinds of problems that we are facing are problems that it's likely that many other countries in the developed world will soon encounter. What have we created? We have created, it seems to me, a society which exists on two levels. Either at the level of the very, very grand, which I can call to be provocative, the level of Kofi Annan, or at the very, very private, behind your front door. And we have evacuated the space in between, which used to be the traditional space of the citizen, the politician, of normal politics, the sort of things that, if you were Aristotle, you would imagine a wealthy, educated population would get involved in. In fact, if you were Aristotle, you would look at Britain and you would think, this would be the ideal place for a vigorous democracy. We've never been so educated. We've never been so healthy. We've never had so many people with so much talent and so much to contribute. We've never traveled so much. I mean, it's a completely bewildering situation we find ourselves in. Under the surface, for example, of the Lake District villages that I represent, which, if you look at them from the outside, appear not to have changed since 1650. Indeed, I look outside my door and every house I can see in the landscape has been there since 1650. The map is identical. But if you were to go through those doors, you would find that 93% of the people in my local village, even in a very remote part of Cumbria, were not born in that village. And that behind those doors are aromatherapists, small businesses being run from laptops, an incredible plethora of consultants working for various different government agencies in and out, and a population that is rotating all the time. And in every meeting I'm in Cumbria now, I'm asking people if they'll stick up their hand if they haven't travelled outside the United Kingdom. And in the last 7 meetings, and these are meetings with upwards of 100 people, I have not had a single hand stuck up. Right? We're becoming a population which would have been unimaginable to our parents or our grandparents. It's a very different type of Britain. So, again, what are we doing with this? Kofi Annan, the first, and the private door, the second. So, the Kofi Annan problem. The Kofi Annan problem is the idea that what we should be doing with our lives, the meaning, the purpose, the justification of our political lives, is to get involved in the grandest and most abstract global projects. So it could be ending global poverty or ending global conflict. The classic example of this model of the world, and these are things that we might be filling in little envelopes, sending off checks to various international NGOs to pursue, campaigning on, sending emails on, talking about in secondary schools. The classic example of this is, of course, Kofi Annan himself. So if you were to look at Kofi Annan's current activities, he is a member of the Elders, which means that he is involved with 12 other people, and simultaneously, if you look at the website, they are solving the conflicts at the moment in Sri Lanka, in Cyprus, in Somalia, in North Korea, and in Israel, Palestine. At the same time, he is the president of the Jacques Chirac Foundation Committee in Paris. He's a director for the Center of Pluralism in Canada. He is a fellow at 2 different institutions in New York, one of them at Columbia University. He runs the African Green Initiative. He led the Kenyan peace process. He has collected 78 different honorary doctorates and prizes over the last few years, and he is, of course, also head of the Kofi Annan Foundation. And this phenomenon of the modern world is very interesting. So if there is a problem in Syria, what do? Well, you call up Kofi Annan, who's also simultaneously the Lee Kuan Yew Professor of Government at the National University of Singapore, simultaneously along with all these other things. And he will get on a plane for Singapore, and he will come to Syria, and he will propose a solution to the problem. This is a great ideal, but it is an ideal that represents, I think, without being mean about Kofi Annan, who I'm sure is a very splendid individual, but I think he's symbolic of a lack of seriousness. The idea that we kind of created a culture based on the preposterous idea that you can have a few global celebrities who are capable of flying into a highly complex situation on the basis of a week or 2 weeks or even 6 months on the ground, coming up with a solution where we would not imagine it would make sense. For example, in our own hometown, let's say I had a problem in Wigton with flooding. Right? There was a problem with water overflowing in Wigton, relatively simple problem, something to do with water movement, water flow, drainage, heights of houses. Would I call in Kofi Annan? No. Even though it's quite a simple situation, I wouldn't call him in. If, on the other hand, I'm facing a situation based on the movement of 2 million refugees, highly complex sectarian and tribal affiliations, in a completely alien culture with a different language and a different context, nevertheless, I have this idea that somehow I can call him in. So a much more difficult situation, and a much more, unfortunately, I think, unconvincing trivial solution. The second element is the private door element. So we lurch from a fantasy that, and we see these fantasies all the time. I'm being mean to Kofi Annan, but the fantasy is carried through in every website, every TED talk, every Davos conference, every visit to see a West Coast philanthropist who's setting up a new global technology platform which is going to deliver microcredit to women in Bangladesh using a new mobile phone app, or some brilliant new concept to do with solar panels which is going to transform the lives of communities in sub-Saharan Africa. When we're not doing that, we're at the other extreme. We're locked inside our houses. So that many, many people of my generation, when you ask them why they're not involved in politics, will say, well, we're too busy. We're much busier than the previous generation. And what that seems to mean is they're busy, my experience, my friends, looking after their children. They're busy inside their houses, worrying about their children, right? They're worrying about, if I was going to be mean or create a cliche out of this, maybe they're cooking an organic meal. Maybe they're worrying about how to get their children into a particular school. Maybe they're fussing about whether or not they've succeeded in concentrating on some particular issue which I think if you were a 19th century man or woman might not seem a fully fulfilling purpose in your life. If you were Gladstone, you might think that some of these activities were not the activities to which you would wish to devote yourself. Right? In the middle then, between the front door and you filling in the check to encourage Kofi Annan to do whatever he's doing, is the whole space of being a citizen. And that's what's so extraordinary. we are somehow not using these people. My friends who are sitting fussing about their children, I suspect, don't really feel that that is a fully fulfilling life. I suspect they're doing it because they're not quite sure what else they can do. One of the things, for example, that's attracting people to the Scottish Nationalist Party at the moment, I noticed talking to youth activists, is they love the idea of being involved. They want to go out and campaign, they want to sit up all night smoking cigarettes and talking about big ideas, and they want to be canvassing, and they don't feel they're getting that anywhere. They don't feel they can do any of that stuff. It's the same, not just if you're a young person. I mean, a young person, maybe you can join the Scottish Nationalist Party and go around and lead your great crusade around the streets of Edinburgh, but it's the same if you're an older person. You're maybe 65, you're recently retired, you're full of ideas, you're full of energy, you really want to contribute to your society, you turn up in your village, and you're told that if you're lucky, you can mow the lawn in front of the parish hall, or if you're very, very lucky, you may be able to organise the pub quiz at 9 o'clock on Saturday night. And you come to your MP's surgery and you say, I really want to get involved. I really, really want to do something for my society. So I say, okay, I'm going to put you in touch with a local charity. And the local charity essentially says, I'm sorry, we're oversubscribed. We don't have any more room for any more volunteers. And when you really push them on this, why? Well, it turns out that the modern world seems to be, in some odd way, too complicated. Turns out that if they were to take on this volunteer, they would have to follow a whole series of procedures. They'd have to make sure that they had a transparent hiring process. They'd have to ensure that they put them through the right training courses. They'd have to make sure that everything was set up in the right way before they could really use them. As a result, we have created this preposterous situation where we're all beginning to feel like superfluous individuals, right? Where we're generating more and more educated, healthy, energetic people who want to do something with their lives, who want to change the world, because that's what we're all told to do at school. And what we're actually setting ourselves up for is tragedy and disappointment. Every little child sitting there in primary and secondary school being told by their teachers and by their parents, you can be anything, you can change the world, you can go out there and be Nelson Mandela, you can be Gandhi, and they leave school and suddenly that opportunity is not presented to them. Right? What does this mean? Well, I would like to know from you what we do about this situation. And I would suggest that one of the things we might like to think about doing about this situation is local democracy. Tapping this energy by actually getting people to run their own communities. The one thing we know about young people or old people in communities is they know more, care more, can do more about local issues than a distant official sitting here in London or even perhaps in Brussels. They might be able to, for example, have a much better idea about exactly what kind of planning they want. They might have a better idea about exactly where they would like the local school to be supported, exactly how they'd like the bus route to operate, how the gritting should operate. And all that energy that's going at the moment, obviously, generally into single issue campaigns, into mountain rescue, into first responders, into the hospice at home movement, should be redirected towards taking responsibility for your own community and becoming, in a fuller sense, a citizen. Now, we have begun, and I've seen some quite encouraging signs in Cumbria that we're beginning to move in the right direction. And one of those is neighbourhood planning, which has been very exciting. We did a referendum on neighbourhood planning in Upper Eden. We were the first people to get it through, and it's been really revolutionary. It's been exhausting, it's been really difficult for the people who led it. Tom Wolfe, who did it, put 2.5 years of his life into getting this through. But finally we have a situation in which the communities have defined what kind of planning they want, and it's not NIMBY planning. They're very keen to encourage affordable housing, they're very keen to encourage barn conversions. They've managed to define exactly how many houses they want around each village, the rate at which they're to be built, the style of those houses, and now if you want to build in Upper Eden, instead of doing what you did in the past, which is going to Eden District Council and being told by the planner you can't do it, you now go to the planner in Eden District Council and they look at what the community have voted for in the referendum in order to determine whether or not you should get this form of house. Again, in broadband, and these are relatively trivial examples, but I want to give you a sense of this energy. We've succeeded in Fell End, where we thought we could never get any broadband access at all. 10 houses at the end of a 10-mile valley. We've managed to run fibre optic cables directly to each house, fibre to the premises, And we've done so because the community's taken responsibility, because the community has decided to dig their own trenches, to talk to every landowner to waive the wayleaves, to sign up 90% of the community to take the services, and in doing so are able to go back to British Telecom and reduce the cost of the project from about £300,000 to about £17,000. And finally, and painfully, the government has stepped in and put in the £17,000 to bridge the gap, and we have a really good example of community, government, and private industry working together to deliver something that previously seemed impossible. But we're not really going to get there. We're not going to really tap this energy unless we begin to validate the role of being a citizen or a politician. Bring out its nobility, bring out its appeal. What I find depressing is that when I'm up in a market town, the top of the Pennines, and people are arguing about whether they should be sending off a proposal to the Heritage Lottery to restore the Methodist Church, or whether they should be working on the Wesleyan Chapel, or whether they should be raising £1 million for the Anglican Church, and whether they're going to convert everybody to gas and everybody to wood, and all these things happening within a market town of 750 people, so all these different agendas, all these different grant applications going forward to all these different foundations, and nobody in the centre taking responsibility, no French mayor, nobody standing up and saying, this is my plan, this is how much I'm going to tax you, these are the priorities, if you don't like it, vote me out. And when I propose this to communities, they say, oh, we don't want a dictator. Right? They want a dictator. This is an elected mayor we're talking about. Nevertheless, Britain has somehow developed a very, very disturbing, troubling love of a sort of amorphous, unaccountable civil society, of grants coming not from taxing the people in their market town, but actually from taxes on people who are buying lottery tickets being diverted through some very, very opaque system and allocated on the basis of the preferences of that lottery to these different churches. And in the middle of the whole thing, aren't the people pushing to shape their own environment, to shape the life they want for their children, to work out what our civilization is? So, I'm finishing on this because I'd like your views, but to conclude, the really big question here, there in Parliament, is what kind of civilization do we want over the next 200 or 300 years? What kind of country do we want to be? What's the point of educating us? What's the point of feeding us? What's the point of keeping us alive? And what's the point of our whole population? We're not doing anything with it. What we should be trying to do is create a civilization which intimidates our descendants. We want to create a civilization that people can look at and say, this is like Venice under the Doges. This is the Roman Republic. This was the Britain of the 21st century. This was a place where all this extraordinary investment in people turned into something, rather than that rather grim world that you go through, having been told that you can be Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, reaching the age of 18, applying for an internship in some MP's office, wandering around doing a little bit of photocopying, realizing that you're not actually changing the world, and ending up as a management consultant. Thank you all very much.
Oh no, I'm just I'll just shout. Thank you, that was fantastic. If you have a question, please stick up your hand. I'll take them in groups if there are groups, otherwise I'll just make some up. And if you can say who you are, where you're from, and try and be reasonably brief, that would be helpful. Baroness Hannam, and then one at the back.
Baroness Hannam from the House of Lords. Rory, I'm conscious of all that you've been talking about, that you haven't once mentioned the word representation. And the whole of democracy seems to me to be based on the fact that you elect somebody to represent you. Now, is that one of the holes that we got ourselves stuck in? That we don't want to be represented, we don't like what the people are saying they're going to represent us about, and we actually don't agree when they represent us anyway.
I think that's...
Oh, do you want to do them one by one?
Well, no, we're happy to take two. Yes, take two. Yes, I'll take two at a time. Yeah.
Hi, Neil Johnston, Paddington Development Trust. Everything that you're describing, Rory, is happening up the road in your Westminster, where a group of a ward population is attempting to set up its own council. And I think that the issues that you're sort of outlining as opposed to detailing are complex. They're surrounded by uncertainty because there's no surety of tenure, so to speak, in achieving power and then being able to exercise it in a democratic context. And one of the key issues, and I'm sure it relates to Cambria too, is the whole nature of fiscal democracy, the democratization of capital, and without being a Trotskyist, that also involves the private sector, in that citizens are the state, and the state is citizens. Not that there are two things, as it were, one working on the other, but that there is a consciousness within a democratic population that it is responsible for and responsible to itself and the power that extends from this.
Right. Well, I think these two points are clearly related, but let me take them in reverse order. You're absolutely right. I mean, that central insight that citizens are the state and the state are the citizens is incredibly important. That statement, of course, reveals to us the fact that in most daily lives, as a matter of anthropology, as a matter of study, people don't feel like that. That isn't the way that people imagine their society. It's not the way they imagine the state. It's not the way they imagine themselves. And I think it is how they ought to imagine themselves, because I think Aristotle is right. I think we are political animals. I think we are most fulfilled, most satisfied when we are actively engaged in citizens in making the decisions on how resources should be distributed, what kind of civilization we want to be. And in order to encourage that, I think we need to create the constitutional structures to make that possible. The challenge facing any development trust, or indeed anybody trying to set itself up at the moment, is the extraordinary ambiguity around it. I mean, I can say to a market town in Cumbria, why don't you have a directly elected mayor? Let's try it, let's have a referendum, let's push it through. But the fact that the power that that person would have is so uncertain, the durability of it so questionable, the terrible frustration that some communities experience, which is that they put all this time and energy into setting something up, and then find that in the end they meet obstacles that nobody had quite anticipated, which may be called 100 different things. They may be called state aid regulations, they may be called procurement regulations, they may simply be to do with what the Treasury will or will not permit you to do. They may be to do with various forms of special interest, specialists, expertise getting in the way. So I'm being very abstract, but, and this is stuff that you're very familiar with, but for people in the audience who aren't so familiar with it, just to give concrete examples, let's say you had decided to set yourself up as a broadband activist group in a small area. You would have begun with the feeling that you could organize yourselves, map out the fiber optic pattern, lay the fiber optic cable in the road, work out how to do it much cheaper, and then go to the government for some money in order to bridge the gap. And you would discover that there are any number of rules, and you would discover it quite late in the process, that actually prevent you from doing this. It would turn out, for example, that for the government to give you even a very small amount of money, for the government, for example, to give you £17,000 for 50 houses, an official would say that they would need to comply with European state aid regulations, and they would need state aid clearance from Brussels. You would then go back and say, how can this be true? Surely there's a de minimis clause, which means 17,000 isn't covered because it's under 500,000. And they would then explain that the company with whom you're operating, which is British Telecom, receives government money far in excess of 500,000, and therefore the de minimis clause doesn't apply, and you do need the state aid clearance. The next stage is you would then need to prove that 17,000, which in the end would have to go to British Telecom, had been run through a fully transparent procurement process. You would then have to go through a process laying out your request for bids. You'd have to show that all the other major telecoms companies had been given an opportunity to bid for this, even though you're saying all the time, this is ridiculous. I know the only people who can ever do this is BT. They're the only people who've got any fibre optic cable anywhere near here. Their exchange is the end of our valley, and Fujitsu doesn't have any presence in this county at all. Nevertheless, you would have to go through that full process. And you would think, month by month, that you'd finished. You'd think that you'd ticked every box, and every time there would be another box that you had failed to tick. And these very small sums of money wouldn't quite come. And eventually, after 2.5 years, you would begin to feel a bit ground down by the whole thing. You'd begin to feel that your rather small thing that you wanted to do was causing you enormous amounts of pain. So that, in a sense, leads into the baroness, because part of it